taxonomic group that I'm going to talk about today is snakes and a lizard. And they are throughout Muskoka. We have quite a few species at risk that are snakes and one lizard in Muskoka. So just briefly, just the talk objectives that I'll have for today, I'll go that way, is introduction to the snakes and lizards. And these guys are collectively known as squamates. They come from the order Squamata, which is an order within the class Reptilia. And I'd love to continue to use squamates all the time, but I don't think people are going to catch hold of the term. And so we often have to throw in the skink at the end. And I guess it works because we only have one lizard here in Ontario. But elsewhere in North America, we have quite a few more lizards. So Squamata, squamates, are what they should be referred to as. I've been lucky enough to be involved with several intense, detailed research studies on snakes in Ontario. And so I'm going to describe the ones that we have at risk here in Muskoka, Parry Sound, but I'm also going to delve a bit into their natural history and their ecology, because that information is ultimately the most interesting things about these animals. Jan went through this morning, for those of you who were here, the two committees that evaluate species in Canada and in Ontario. We have COSEWIC, the federal body, and we have CSIRO, the provincial body. What usually happens is COSEWIC evaluates the species first. They've been around longer than CSIRO, so they get the species first. They make a number of recommendations. They come up with a status at a federal level. Then CSIRO, if the species is present in Ontario, reviews that same information and then makes a designation based on COSEWIC's recommendations, but then also specific to Ontario. Because you can imagine some species, if they're only found in Ontario, it's likely that the two designations will match. It'll be threatened and threatened or endangered and endangered. But for some others, if the species is widespread in Alberta, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the federal designation may actually be less than the provincial designation. And the inverse is also true. You may have a higher designation federally than you do provincially. And that's the case with several of the birds that Jan discussed this morning, actually. Golden-winged warbler, or olive-sided flycatcher being one of them. It's threatened federally, but only special concern provincially. Species at risk. Extirpated, endangered, threatened, special concern, and the bottom two classes are also available. When you do the assessment, it can come out that it is not at risk. After going through all the criteria, evaluating it, you may come out not at risk. And for many other species, it's simply data deficient. They can do the evaluation, but there's not enough information to say if the species is at risk. The implications of these designations are twofold, essentially. Endangered and threatened, they're protected under the new Endangered Species Act legislation. Both as individuals and soon to be all of the habitat is protected. The third tier, special concern, although it's listed on the Species at Risk in Ontario list, it's not actually provided protection under the ESA, and it gets protection intermittent through the Planning Act and through the provincial policy statement, depending on who's doing the evaluation, whether or not it actually is protected under significant wildlife habitat. So it's definitely a lot less clear whether the habitat is protected. These are our snakes in the Muskoka, Georgian Bay region that are designated. The eastern fox snake, Massasauga, eastern hognose snake, threatened. So those species are protected under the ESA. The special concern species are the milk snake, ribbon snake, and our lone lizard, the five-line skink. And I'm going to go into each of these species and give a little bit of natural history as we go on. But you can see that there are three snakes are threatened, and two snakes are special concern, one lizard. So one thing, if you do environmental assessments in this area, you will start to notice that reptiles as a group are disproportionately represented as species at risk here. Birds are now starting to catch up. It's only now. that birds are being evaluated, and we're getting several more in the Muskoka, Georgian Bay region. But mammals, there's only really the eastern wolf in our area that has a special concern designation. And yet we have, I don't know how the Muskoka breakdown goes, but I think there's only one turtle species that's not at risk in Muskoka that's found here. And there are 5 snakes, so 5 out of the 5 out of 10, something to that effect. So it is a high representation. That is one of the reasons why reptiles get a lot of attention in the Muskoka, Georgian Bay region. And I should point out, in comparison to amphibians, which have global declines, which have been documented, there is not any amphibian species at risk in Muskoka. Not provincially. The first species that I'll get into, and one which I'm intimately familiar because I did my master's work on this species, is the eastern fox snake. It's the second largest snake in Ontario, maximum 1.8 meters, but usually not that large, over 1 kilo, lays eggs, is a constrictor, an incredibly good swimmer, as you can see, and an incredibly good climber, as you can see as well. They often climb for food, and they swim for various reasons. They disperse themselves along the Georgian Bay Islands, and the population along the Georgian Bay coast, which is here, is designated threatened, and southwestern Ontario populations are endangered. And this is actually the global range of the eastern fox snake. So it's only found in eastern Michigan and Ohio, northern Ohio, outside of Ontario. So that's one of the big reasons why it has such a high designation. And it is really restricted to the eastern shoreline of Georgian Bay, going inland, not much more than 1 kilometer. Linda, I think, has some of the best inland records of fox snakes along the Georgian Bay coast, but they do not go inland very far. This is a Massasauga, actually, but the reason he's here is that to get a good understanding of what snakes do, currently there's only really one viable option, and that is radiotelemetry. And for us to put transmitters on snakes or in snakes, we actually need to do a surgical procedure to implant these transmitters. So to do such a thing, you morally need to anesthetize this animal. So it's being intubated right now. It's being anesthetized so that it's asleep while we do this procedure. And fortunately with snakes, there's a gap in their body plan. This is a regular body plan of a snake, and you can see that the heart is up here, and this long organ is the liver. Everything is elongated in a snake. These are your gonads, your ovaries, or your testes, and these are your segmented kidneys. And based on analysis of multiple specimens, you can find a spot actually where a transmitter can fit inside that animal. And that's where we surgically implant the transmitter. And there is an antenna that then runs, a 20 to 30 centimeter antenna that runs from the transmitter. And it's a bit longer in a big fox snake, a bit shorter in a small hognose snake. This gives us well, I guess actually that's the transmitter implantation. It's done under all aseptic conditions. I think I've done 200 to 300 implantations personally on fox snakes, Massasaugas, hognose snakes, and Lake Erie water snakes. So we have studied quite a few of the snakes using this methodology, and it's detailed, costly, timely, but it yields amazing results. Because once the transmitters are into those animals, good range up on a rock outcrop like this, you could maybe get 1.5 kilometers from that transmitter. Under bad conditions, if the snake is coiled, the bottom of a wetland, under a log, maybe 50 meters. So it really depends on what the snake is doing, how far away you can pick them up. but the transmitter just pulses every few seconds, pulse, 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 and a receiver picks it up. So it's just beep, 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 and as you get closer, it gets louder. So you can get right within a meter of where that actual snake is sitting regularly. Over a 2-year period is about the length of the transmitter life. So for Georgian Bay fox snakes, this is the kind of habitat that they like. Coastal rock barrens with large rock fragments, fissures in the bedrock, open areas where they can expose themselves to get sun and increase their body temperatures, essentially, is what they're doing for the most part. And while she was doing her study, we were able to have a simultaneous study done in Kildare Provincial Park by Anna Lawson and collect the same data on approximately the same number of fox snakes. So it was a really powerful study to do it simultaneously, and my connection to it is I did all the transmitter implantations for it. And I radio tracked fox snakes years ago on Pelee Island as part of my master's, so I was a good part of it at least. So just starting off on fox snakes' life history, at this time of year, normally, maybe this year they came out a bit early, and now they've been freezing underneath leaf piles and stuff, and they usually emerge from their hibernation areas. And there's actually a second individual fox snake right there. They're both coming out of the same hole, and one of the great findings was that they usually do hibernate communally, anywhere from 2 individuals to several hundred in the Georgian Bay population. That was a really neat finding because we knew that there could be 20 in a hibernation area based on studies years ago, but the recent work in the early 2000s found one, I think it's over 300 maybe, individuals. And you can imagine how incredibly important this nondescript hole in the ground is for that whole population of fox snakes. So really important. After they've emerged from hibernation, they usually disperse, and one of the things that they probably do within the first few weeks is grab themselves a meal because they haven't eaten all winter. And this one's actually eating a rabbit, young rabbit. And if they do find a rabbit warren or a mouse nest, then they will eat it until they can't find any more individuals. So oftentimes they clean out the nest. But rabbits and mice are quite prolific in their reproduction, so they can soon catch up, I'm sure. The fox snakes are also great climbers. The reason they climb is to look for birds' nests, and they will regularly climb the sides of people's cottages and spend time near cottages because of the rodents and the birds that are attracted to them. After they grab a couple meals, probably late May, June, it's mating time for fox snakes. They don't mate when they first come out like garter snakes do. They disperse a bit, and then they seem to find members of the opposite sex on islands in Georgian Bay that they've had to swim to. They somehow find other fox snakes. It's really amazing. I think maybe they remember where they've had good encounters before. They know that island's good. They don't know why, but they're going back there. And so these are just 2 fox snakes at some stage of the courtship. They can stay together for a couple days. And there was some great other combative behavior observed between male fox snakes, duking it out over a female fox snake, and they don't bite each other. They just push each other down and wrestle and become all entwined. And then one male eventually just takes off, and you can't really tell who won, but for some reason that male knows he was defeated, and he gets out of there. And yeah, there's some great observations from their studies that I won't get into. Eventually, as I said, fox snakes are egg layers, so they will lay their eggs oftentimes in rock crevices that have accumulations of soil, or in artificial structures that people have left in their backyards is a great one. Leaf piles and compost piles and such. They can use those as well because they have the right heat and moisture regimes to support the egg development. So people do find, and Glenn has been involved in stewardship activities to help people create artificial nest sites for fox snakes in Georgian Bay. And it's still an ongoing project. I have had success on Pelee Island where we had more fox snakes. but it's harder in Georgian Bay to convince them to use the site. The next species that actually have the most research experience on is the Massasauga, and I've radio tracked these guys for something like 10 years or so as part of studies with M&R and at Kildare. And Massasaugas give birth to live young as opposed to the egg layers, which is pretty neat. This guy is just a young Massasauga, and they are ambush predators. They are venomous, as people would know, being a rattlesnake. That allows them to be an ambush predator. They just wait for a mouse to run by, or a chipmunk, or an unlucky bird. They strike out, inject venom, and then wait for that animal to expire, and then they go and find their prey. Very efficient venom injection system, but really your danger to public is minimal. I mean, I don't have a problem saying that because it's been so long since someone was in serious medical condition because of a Massasauga, and you just go to the hospital if you ever are bitten. They are also designated threatened. Massasaugas also eat, as I mentioned, they're really good quick predators, and this one's just eating a hairy-tailed mole. And we've seen them eat birds that moved past a Massasauga, chipmunks, and they will go into ground nesting bird nests as well, and eat young mice and such if they find them as well. Their mating season isn't in the spring like the fox snake. It's actually late July into early August. All my thoughts on when the duration of these periods are changing now that I give this talk, given what we've seen over the last few years. I'm trying to make everything earlier because with reptiles, the warmer the year is, the earlier they can engage in these activities because their babies grow faster, so they give birth earlier, so they have more time to forage, so they may start their mating season earlier, so their eggs may hatch earlier. So there's a lot of changes going on now, and formerly they started their mating season in really warm years about mid-July, and cold years not till August. But you can see that probably with climate change, everything will shift earlier and be a bit more difficult to predict, I think. These are just two Massasaugas that are coiled together, and they will, again, stay together anyway from 2 hours to 2 days. And one of the reasons they can, I mentioned that the females stay at these gestation sites all summer long, and the mating season starts in August. The key thing for Massasaugas is that the females only reproduce every second or third or fourth year. And so they actually will mate one August, then store the sperm over the winter, and then not give birth until that following summer. So they have a year off every year, maybe 2 years if it's a more young. Maybe if they maxed out their reproductive effort, they may have to take 2 years to recover. So the females do give a lot because they do spend all that time taking care of the young, essentially, by moving around. These are just young Massasaugas, and again, they would be born, average 12 of them, but I have observed up to 19. So if you're a female that had 19, you might need 2 years off, as opposed to a female that just had 8 and only needs the 1 year off. So it's a trade-off. You get more for, but you need more recovery time. It seems it is logical. The final of the threatened species, the snake species at least, is the Hognose snake. And we radio tracked a number of these species, this individual, sorry, as well. And Hognose snakes are about the same size as a Massasauga usually, and they're quite stout-bodied or stocky and quite slow. But like the fox snake, they lay eggs, and they're a very active forager, which makes them cover large areas. And the reason they're so active, they feed on toads pretty much exclusively in this area. And toads are all over the landscape. You'd think they were all in wetlands, but toads actually move out onto rock out barrens, they move into the forest, they move everywhere. And the Hognose snake seeks them out. And The hognose snakes also are known for incredible displays. They're the actor of the snake world, and they can get all flared up and do a very good demonstration of how to convince someone to stay away from you. And I'll talk about the death display in a second, actually. They are, by the way, also threatened. And starting off for their life history, hognose snakes are egg layers. And they lay their eggs about the end of June. And unlike the other two snakes, unlike any snake in Ontario, they actually will excavate their nest. So they will find a location that has soil that they can move around, and they will dig underneath the soil and dig a nest and lay their eggs in that nest really quickly. And that's just her head sticking out of that little hole there. She'll drop her eggs off, and then she'll bury them back up and leave those eggs to their own devices for the rest of the summer. And they'll maybe hatch out in late August, September. The other thing about hognose snakes is this incredible threat display where they gape their mouth, they huff and puff, and they expand their ribs, and they do look like a little cobra. The way the sounds that they're making, weaving back and forth. If that doesn't convince you that they're incredibly scary and you should leave them alone, then they flip themselves over, play dead, and sometimes only partially dead. This guy's just partially dead. And when he thinks that you're not looking, he exhibits signs of life. But if you don't let them go back about their business, then they will take it to the extreme. They will stop breathing, and you can see the mucous membranes in the mouth go all blue. And yeah, you should just leave them alone when they do that, because they are probably going a little overboard. They love toads, as I said. I'll go through this really quickly. Radiotelemetry allows you to see these things that you probably would never see any other way. But when they do find a toad, they simply grab it, and their face stretches, their jaw stretches, and they just consume this guy. And I love toads, so this is very hard to watch, but it's part of nature, of course. And that took about 40-45 minutes. And he'll have to, of course, readjust his jaw there. It's a little stretched out, and they usually do take a big yawn afterwards. And then a tongue flick to let you know that everything's back in place, and they're as scary as they always were. They're a bit vulnerable when they have the food in their mouth, so it is good to consume the food quickly. And this slide's just to remind me that they move really far. And we've tracked them. This guy here, Pumbaa, I think, over the course of the entire summer, moved straight line distances, 32 kilometers. Wow. So that's us tracking him probably a kilometer every day between locations. So they moved extraordinary distances. And these other snakes that I'll have to go through incredibly fast, but I don't know much about them. One of the reasons we don't know much about milk snakes is they are only special concern. They were only recently designated. So they haven't received as much attention, and they're smaller. So our transmitters really limit the size of the snakes that we can study. And it's probably wise to wait for the transmitters to get smaller before we try to study some of the smaller species. There has been some work done with milk snakes. So we do obviously know that they lay eggs, are constrictors. You don't see them that often because they're mostly nocturnal. And you usually find them under pieces of wood or rocks. You find ribbon snakes in the same kind of locations, under rocks, but also in wetlands. They spend a lot of time around wetlands, if not in them, in the vegetation. And they're also special concerns. And they're very similar to garter snakes, and the key best difference is this half moon between the eye and the nostril. You can see it there. And the other way to tell is on the scales. There's differences in scale counts, and they are thinner than a garter snake. But the little eye semicircle is the best one. You can usually see that with close focus binoculars, so you don't have to pick the animal up or anything. Also special concern. And finally, our lone lizard species in Ontario, the 5-line skink, now Plestiodon fasciatus, and it lays eggs as well. And the cool thing is that this is a female with her eggs under a rock. They stay with their eggs. Unlike the snakes that we have here, these guys stay with their eggs. The mother tends them. I'm not sure how much she does, but she probably moves them around into better positions underneath the rock, and will stay with them until they hatch. So that's some pretty neat parental behavior. The males during mating season get this beautiful orange chin, and it probably has to do with intimidating other males. And then they have this great blue tail, the young ones do at least, for the first several years. And that tail can actually fall off if you're not careful handling that individual. So it's best not to hold them. You can usually get really good looks by just being careful and slow. And just a little guy. We got our rocks. No, I'm pretty much done, and that's
Here comes the hook.
that's the biggest rock pile, artificial rock pile you ever see. And that was a pile of asphalt near MacTier where some of our studies were done. And there was one hognose snake, 2 maybe, that thought this was the best rock baron ever. And he's in here, and I was able to zoom in on him a bit. And it was this large thermal mass, you know, that he could hide in, and no one could ever get him out of that big pile of stuff. And every time he would shed his skin or get a meal, he would go back to that giant pile. Pretty neat, but this was just to illustrate the concept that Dirk mentioned this morning, and it's just a mosaic. It's rock barren, wetland, rock barren, forest, wetland. This is what pretty much all of those species that I mentioned use in Georgian Bay, Muskoka. The smaller species use less area. Hognose snakes use the most, but they do all thrive in this type of environment. And one of the things that can really disrupt that type of environment and cause problems for these species are roads. And I'm not going to talk about roads, but I often do talk about roads and their impacts on reptiles, and so I want to mention that the mosaic is perfect the way it is, but when you do put roads through it, then you do cause these sources of mortality that these reptiles are not built or evolved to withstand. And that's it. That's some of my crazy colleagues.
Is the legislation working to protect these creatures? The reason I ask is I have heard landowners say, if you find a member of an endangered species, kill it off quick or you're going to have some rather draconian restrictions on your land use.
Oh, yeah, that's a terrible recommendation philosophy to have, of course. It's always been illegal to kill them, any of these species. The penalties are severe now. It's been illegal before. The penalties are severe. A friend of mine is one of the head M&R prosecutors under the Endangered Species Act, and they've now successfully prosecuted movement of the animals, so illegally taking them from an area, and the fines were pretty stiff. They've now just, for the first time, successfully prosecuted habitat destruction for eastern fox snake, actually, in Georgian Bay. And this all occurred within, decision probably came out a month ago, and the sentencing is just pending. But so I think there should be some precedents coming up that you can choose that approach to kill them off. It's always a risk, right? It's always a risk when you break the law, of course. But they are trying to make the penalties much more severe so that people don't think they can get off with a slap on the wrist.
We have another question over here.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. It's been very interesting. What sort of things can a property owner do to help improve habitat for some of these species? If we have a pile of asphalt, or what should we do?
If you don't have a spare pile of asphalt, then there are nest sites at least for fox snakes, but that's only if you're along the Georgian Bay coast. You can get information from the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve on how to create microhabitats for some of these creatures. That's probably the best approach. and that's what I would recommend. And you can modify certain rock structures to make them more likely to be used. But yeah, Glenda's the person to contact about that for sure.
Thank you. Do they use brush piles and things like that as well? Or
Yeah, they do. Yeah. And so if you have areas that you don't mind rattlesnakes coming to, which I wouldn't, I'd love them to come to my property, you can make brush piles and they will be attracted to them, largely because it provides good shelter. Rodents show up there, that's what they want to feed on. And it's good thermally for them to be able to use that as well. So you can.
Okay. One more, Penny?
It's, we need to tell people that it's great to have a box snake under your cottage. You'll never have any mice.
Oh, yeah.
They're better than cats.
Yeah, far better. Totally agree. Yeah, it's amazing. And when you can get along with fox snakes and the other snakes, I mean, it's so much better because they can persist around people if people don't harm them. They really can.
One more quick one. I know it's...
Yeah, I was surprised to see someone who had a pet fox snake because it's a constrictor. Are there regulations or fines for taking native species from...
Yeah.
Does that happen?
It is, unless you have some special permit from the MNR. Yeah, any of the reptiles that are listed, you're not supposed to have as pets in Ontario. Some people do have them for educational purposes and have special permits, but if not, then you're not supposed to have them.
The one thing I have seen a lot that I was really, really pleased is are these groups of people that take snakes around to markets and events so that people can get over their fear of snakes.
Yeah, Glenda does that a lot with the native reptiles, and there are other groups like Sensational Snakes that take different species, but they have really tried to take Ontario's native species and bring those around, because that's most important for us to get familiar with. And they do have snakes to handle and everything. And fox snakes are great to handle.
They are.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Great.